streets of Tang Dynasty Hebei Dao, a large economy functioned with the support of local military protection. Hebei Dao in the Tang Dynasty was one of the empire-level regional divisions, a large supervisory region north of the Yellow River, roughly corresponding to the later Hebei region and parts of adjacent provinces. It was here that the famous Zen monk Rinzai noted a peculiar character named Puhua. Puhua shouting, "Myōtō-rai myōtō da, antō-rai antō da, shihō hachimen rai senpū da, kokū-rai renka da," while eating some raw veggies in the streets. Welcome back to another video on the Taidu Shakuhachi channel. My name is Sean Taidu Head, and I am your licensed Shakuhachi teacher. In today's Unmasked series, we are going over the legendary Puhua, or Fuke Zenji. In the dim space between history and legend, the figure of Fuke Zenji emerges. His name drifts through the centuries like a distant bell, struck once, then gone, yet still vibrating in the mind of those who listen closely. In Japan, Fuke Zenji is remembered as a wandering Zen master of the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907, a disciple, or at least a spiritual companion, of Rinzai Yishuang, Rinzai in Japanese. He does not sit enthroned in a monastery. He carries no sutras, claims no rank, and establishes no school. Instead, he walks the streets, ringing a bell, calling out to the living moment. Fuke preached, "When light comes, light responds. When darkness comes, darkness responds." Sound itself becomes his teaching. Over time, this bell changes form. In the Japanese imagination, it becomes bamboo. Breath replaces metal. What was once a clang in the streets becomes a tone drawn slowly from the body. The shakuhachi appears as a vehicle for sound as awakening, breath as Zen meditation. Through this transformation, Fuke Zenji becomes the mythic ancestor of Suizen, the man whose spirit said to flow through the hollow bore of the flute. But the Fuke sect mythology had its own agenda. During the Edo period, when Komuso monks traveled Japan with baskets over their heads, Fuke Zenji stood quietly behind them as a guarantor of legitimacy. His name authorized movement, protected practice, and declared that this was not music, but Zen itself. The less that could be proven about him, the more useful he became. An ancient Chinese master who left no writings, no institution, and no rules. What better founder could there be? And yet, when we turn to the surviving records, the picture begins to shift. In Chinese sources, Fuke is fleeting. He appears briefly, almost incidentally, a marginal figure in the orbit of Rinzai, known more for eccentric behavior than for finding anything at all. There is no flute, no lineage, no school. The bell rings once, and the text moves on. So who then was Fuke Zenji? And just as importantly, who was he not? This video sets out to answer those questions with care and precision. We will move slowly through the period documentation, Chinese Zen text, Japanese Edo period records, sectarian histories, and later reinterpretations. We will trace how a minor historical figure became a towering ancestral presence and how sound, breath, and ideology were woven together across centuries. This is not an attempt to tear down tradition nor to romanticize it. Rather, it is an invitation to look clearly, to distinguish history from hagiography, record from resonance. And by the end, Fuke Zenji will not stand as a convenient myth or a hollow symbol, but as something far more interesting. A mirror reflected the needs, aspirations, and inventions of the culture that invoked his name. The bell will ring again today. This time, we will listen carefully. Who was Fuke Zenji? Fuke Zenji, known in Chinese sources as Zhenjiu Puhua, is traditionally described as an itinerant Zen priest of the Tang Dynasty, active in the 9th century. Little is known with certainty about his origins. His place of birth remains unclear, though his epithet, Zhenjiu, may associate him with the region of modern Hebei. A short note from Professor James Ben, quote, "Following the An Lushan rebellion, the Hebei region remained a hotbed of military autonomy and social unrest. It was a garrison culture, distinct from the refined court culture of the capital Chang'an. The Chan Buddhism that flourished here. The Hangzhou school, represented by Linji Yishuan, mirrored this rough, martial environment. It was characterized by shouting, beating, and direct confrontation. Puhua embodies the wild spirit of Hebei Chan. Back to Sean. What survives of his life exists primarily in fragmentary anecdotes, later legend, and a small number of reliable textual references. In early accounts, Fuke appears as a wandering eccentric, often depicted as moving through the streets of Zhengzhou in a state of feigned or near madness while ringing a handbell. He is said to have attained sudden enlightenment upon hearing the sound of a bell, and legend holds that even after his death, the sound of his bell could still be heard echoing through the city. This motif of sound, unfixed, impermanent, and direct, became central to his later reception. The best-known historical source that mentions Fuke is the Linji Lu, the record of Linji, known in Japanese as the Rinzai Roku, a foundational Tang Dynasty Zen text. There, he is portrayed as a marginal yet striking figure, a student of the Dharma era of Pancha Baoji, and a contemporary, sometimes friend and sometimes provocateur, of Linji Yishuan, Rinzai, the founder of the Rinzai school. By the way, Panshan Baoji is a very commonly quoted Zen master in the early Komoso documents like the Kaido Honsoku. In these records, Fuke is not presented as a founder of any sect, but rather as an iconoclastic individual whose teaching style relied on shock, gesture, and spontaneous action rather than doctrinal exposition. His exchanges with Linji consistently emphasize the rejection of conceptual distinctions such as refinement and coarseness, pointing instead towards a direct, embodied understanding of the Dharma. There is another source that offers a different portrait of Fuke, which is the Zhu Tangji. It offers an even rawer, less polished version of Fuke, if you can imagine that. Later Japanese sources, most notably the Kyotaku Denki, first published in the 18th century, radically expand Fuke's role. In these texts, he is credited with founding the Zen lineage centered on sound-based practice and is retroactively positioned as the spiritual ancestor of the Fuke sect and its mendicant monks, the Komusou. These claims, however, have been shown to be largely fabricated, created to provide historical legitimacy and institutional authority to an Edo period Fukeshu under Tokugawa rule. No evidence exists in Chinese sources that such a sect existed during Fuke's lifetime. Despite this, certain themes remain consistent across both early and later records. Fuke's eccentricity, his crazy wisdom, and his preference for nonverbal teaching. Stories portray him overturning tables, somersaulting at solemn moments, and refusing social or doctrinal conventions. One famous anecdote recounts him ringing a bell through the marketplace while chanting cryptic verses about light and darkness alike, responding equally against each other. This non-dualistic imagery was later reinterpreted by Japanese practitioners as a philosophical precedent for suizen or blowing meditation. According to the legend in the Kyotaku Denki, a follower named Chohaku imitated the sound of Fuke's bell on a bamboo flute, naming it Kyotaku, false bell. This story, though historically unreliable, became foundational for the Shakuhachi tradition and contributed to Fuke's popularity in Japanese art. He appears in paintings and monochrome ink works by Japanese artists of the Muromachi and Momoyama period, and even through modern-day sumie paintings. There is even one painting that is attributed to Liang Kai, a famous Chinese artist of the 13th century. Accounts of Fuke's death further reinforce his liminal status between history and myth. In one story, he predicts his own death, enters a coffin, and disappears entirely, leaving behind only the sound of his bell ringing from the sky. Taken together, these sources suggest that Fuke was likely a real, but minor Tang Dynasty Zen figure whose historical footprint is small, yet whose posthumous significance grew enormously through later Japanese reinterpretation. What he was not, despite later claims, was the founder of a Shakuhachi-based Zen sect. What he was, according to the earliest records, was a self-directed, iconoclastic practitioner whose actions were later read as exemplifying Zen's resistance to fixation, formality, and institutional closure, and fits the larger pattern of eccentric Tang monks who aren't even necessarily Chan masters. Fuke Zenji in the historical record. Now comes the difficult task of establishing Fuke Zenji in the historical record. We will go over the few reliable documents which have passing mentions of Fuke Zenji. Despite their scarcity, these references actually tell us quite a bit about Fuke Zenji. The Anthology of the Patriarchal Hall, Voices from the 10th Century. The Anthology of the Patriarchal Hall, Zutangji, Japanese Sodōshū, occupies a special place in the history of Zen Buddhism. Compiled in 952 Common Era by two Chinese monks during the turbulent 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period, it is the earliest fully extant multilineal lamp record, Dengulu, of the southern Chan Buddhist tradition. It predates the far better known transmission of the lamp by half a century, offering a window into the world of early Zen teaching before the genre of lineage literature had fully crystallized. Unlike later texts, the anthology is not concerned with genealogy or doctrinal exposition. Its form is deceptively simple. It consists of a succession of 246 biohagiographical entries of individuals, whether legendary or historical, associated with the Chan tradition. Fascicles 1 and 2 cover the 7 Buddhas of the past. The text captures the spontaneity of Zen instruction, recording questions, challenges, cryptic replies, and sometimes outright silence. Through these interactions, the reader gains not only insight into teaching methods, but also a sense of the lived experience of the Zen community at that time. For centuries, the text was lost, surviving only indirectly through references and fragmented copies. The complete form, with all 20 chapters intact, was rediscovered in the 20th centuries at Haeinsa Temple in Korea, preserved as a 13th century woodblock rather than a bound book. This preservation method underscores both the fragility and resilience of Zen textual culture. In short, the Anthology of the Patriarchal Hall offers a glimpse of Zen in its early, unfiltered form, a world where meaning arises in conversation, where the lines between question and answer is blurred, and where the focus is on practice, presence, and direct experience rather than lineage or later myth-making. Rediscovered centuries later, it serves as a reminder that much of what became tradition in Zen and later in Japanese Shakuhachi mythologies was built on dialogue, improvisation, and lived practice, not on codified text or retrospective storytelling. This document is also important for us because now our character Fuke Zenji appears here. Thanks to Ghent University and the database of medieval Chinese texts, there is a wonderful table of contents and a formal structure of original document in an easily readable Excel file. Entry 223, Fuke Zenji's name appears. Now, unfortunately for us, there is no full-length English translation of this document, but there are small sections in which analysis has been done. This is also not a document that one just lightly decides to translate on a whim. Though, while we're writing this script, I did reach out to Professor James Ben at McMaster University, and he had this to add. The Zutangji maintains separate entries for Rinzai and Puhua. Their status as individual masters in the Hangzhou house lineage, but through different successors of the fountainhead. Mazu Daoyi for Linji, the successor runs Mazu, Baizhang, Huangbo, then Linji. For Puhua, Mazu, Panshan Baoji, Puhua. It is worth noting that Puhua does not appear at all in the 6th narrative, page 120, episodes of the Linji entry, while Linji does appear in 4 out of the 6 narrative episodes of the Puhua entry. Moreover, the Puhua entry gives Puhua his full due as the master in his own right, a protagonist worthy of his story. As such, Puhua predominates in episodes where Linji appears with him, and he is not merely a subsidiary character as he is portrayed in the Linji Lu. Back to Sean. However, we are fortunate because we do have the record of Linji, or the Rinzai Roku, which has been translated. In the book The Record of Linji, Translation and Commentary by Ruth Fuller Sasaki, she mentions this. Zhenjiu Fuke, or Zhenjiu Puhua, was a disciple of Panchan Baoji of Youzhou. Baoji, in turn, was an heir of Ma Zu. Very little is known about his life. The biographical accounts found in the records of the Source Mirror and the Song Dynasty biographies of eminent monks consist of little more than anecdotes featuring Puhua. Being a disciple of Panchan is also very important to us as lovers of Shakuhachi history. Not only is the beloved piece Shingetsu, Heart of the Moon, based on one of the poems by Panchan, he is also quoted many times in the Kaido Honsoku, but more on that in another video. The record of Rinzai and its relevance to Fuke Zenji. Here's a short description of the Rinzai from Professor James Ben. The Rinzai, Record of Rinzai, is a foundational collection of sermons, aphorisms, and pedagogical encounters attributed to the Tang Dynasty Chan master Rinzai Yishuan, death in 866-867. While purportedly compiled by his immediate disciples, the extant text is a product of Song Dynasty editorial processes, first appearing in its full form in the Tiangshen Guangdeng Lu, 1036, and reaching its definitive version in 1120. In this capacity, the text functioned as a sectarian classic that retrospectively established the Rinzai school, lineage, and orthodoxy across East Asia. By the Song period, it was celebrated as the definitive articulation of Chan's encountered dialogue, characterized by deliberately provocative and anti-scholastic rhetoric that prioritized the true man of no rank over traditional doctrinal exegesis. Back to Sean. For the study of Fuke Zenji, the record of Rinzai is crucial because it constitutes the earliest and most reliable textual source in which Fuke appears. Unlike later Japanese materials, the Rinzai Lu does not present Fuke as a patriarch, founder, or transmitter of a lineage. Instead, he appears as a marginal yet vivid contemporary within Rinzai's orbit, an eccentric practitioner whose behavior, ringing a bell, shouting, and overturning conventions, embodies the Zen emphasis on immediacy and non-conceptual action. In these passages, Fuke functions less as a teacher in his own right, but more so as a provocateur and mirror, reinforcing Rinzai's rejection of fixed categories such as purity and defilement, refinement and vulgarity. His presence underscores the diversity of Zen expression in the late Tang period, where unconventional conduct was not institutionalized, but tolerated as part of a broader culture of shock and spontaneity. Equally important is what the record of Rinzai does not say. It makes no mention of shakuhachi, sound-based meditation, mendicant flute practice, or any sect associated with Fuke, nor does it suggest any transmission beyond the immediate social and geographical context of 9th century northern China. In this respect, the Rinzai Lu stands as a corrective to later Edo period narratives, anchoring Fuke Zenji firmly within the historical Zen milieu and exposing the extent to which his later elevation into patriarchal figure was the product of retrospective lineage construction rather than contemporaneous tradition. Let's now take a look at some of the text. As a note, I have changed the pronunciation of Puhua to Fuke for the sake of this video. One day, when the master and Fuke were attending a dinner at a patron's house, the master asked, "A hare swallows up the great sea, and a mustard seed contains Mount Sumeru. Is this the marvelous activity of supernatural power, or is it original substance as it is?" Sean speaking now. The master here is referring to Rinzai. The reason why this first anecdote is so important is because it establishes a connection with Rinzai and Fuke. Let's move to the next scene in the same anecdote. Fuke kicked over a table. "How coarse!" exclaimed the master. "What place do you think this is, talking about coarse and fine?" said Fuke. The next day, the master and Fuke again attended a dinner. The master asked, "How does today's feast compare with yesterday's?" Fuke kicked over the dinner table as before. "Good enough," said the master. "But how coarse?" "Blind man," said Fuke. "What's Buddha Dharma got to do with coarse and fine?" The master stuck out his tongue. In the Rinjilu, discourse number 3, Fuke appears neither as a patriarch nor as a doctrinal authority. He is not introduced with a lineage, biography, or institutional role, and he leaves behind no recorded sermons, teaching, or disciples. His presence in the text is episodic and situational. He appears only in encounters and almost always in a manner that frustrates explanation rather than inviting it. In this episode, at the lay patron's feast, is particularly instructive. The setting itself recalls the Vimalakshmi Sutra, where lay contexts are used to unsettle monastic assumptions about hierarchy and sanctity. Rinzai's opening question, whether the paradox of a hare swallowing the great sea and a mustard seed containing Mount Sumeru should be understood as miraculous or supernatural function or as original substance as it is framed as a doctrinal alternative. Both options, however, already presuppose conceptualization. Fuke's response is not verbal. He simply kicks over at dinner table. This act neither confirms nor denies Rinzai's alternatives. Instead, it dissolves the framework in which the question is posed. In doing so, Fuke avoids both metaphysical explanation and rhetorical cleverness. His action interrupts not only the philosophical discussion, but also the social order of the patron's feast, thereby refusing to allow Zen insight to settle into either doctrinal or aesthetic refinement. Rinzai's immediate reaction, how coarse, reveals precisely what Fuke exposes. By introducing the distinction between coarse and fine, Rinzai momentarily re-enters the realm of evaluative judgment. Fuke responds accordingly. What kind of place do you think this is, talking about coarse and fine? The rebuke is direct, but not polemical. It simply points out that such distinctions have no standing within Buddha Dharma. The scene is then repeated on the following day. Rinzai again attempts a comparative evaluation, asking how today's offering compares with yesterday. Fuke again overturns the table. The repetition is significant. It shows that Fuke's conduct is not impulsive or symbolic, but consistent. When Rinzai concedes, good enough but still coarse, Fuke escalates the critique, calling Rinzai blind, and asking what Buddha Dharma could possibly have to do with coarse and fine. Rinzai's final response, sticking out his tongue, signals recognition rather than correction. The exchange ends without resolution, explanation, or doctrinal closure. From a religious standpoint, this episode makes several points clear. First, Fuke's conduct does not communicate a metaphysical teaching. He offers no discourse on emptiness, Buddha nature, or original mind. Second, there is no indication of ascetic discipline, meditative method, or ritual practice associated with him. Third, nothing in this encounter suggests that Fuke functions as a transmitter of a tradition or as a model to be imitated. His role is neither pedagogical nor institutional. What Fuke exemplifies rather is a refusal, specifically a refusal to allow Zen insight to be stabilized as doctrine, aesthetic sensibility, or evaluative judgment. His actions function as interruptions that expose residual attachments, even in figures as central as Rinzai himself. In this sense, Fuke operates not as a teacher in the conventional sense, but as a destabilizing presence within the Zen milieu. One day, Fuke went about the streets, asking people he met for a one-piece gown. They all offered him one, but Fuke declined them all. Rinzai had the steward of the temple buy a coffin, and when Fuke came back, the master said, "I've fixed up a one-piece gown for you." Fuke put the coffin on his shoulders and went around the streets, calling out, "Rinzai fixed me up a one-piece gown. I'm going to the east gate to depart this life." All the townspeople scrambled after him to watch. No, not today," said Fuke. "But tomorrow, I'll go to the south gate to depart this life." After he had done the same thing for 3 days, no one believed him anymore. On the 4th day, not a single person followed him to watch. He went outside the town walls all by himself, got into the coffin, and asked a passerby to nail it up. The news immediately got out. The townspeople all came scrambling. Upon opening the coffin, They saw he had vanished, body and all. Only the sound of his bell could be heard in the sky, receding away. Tinkle, tinkle, tinkle. Bell in the sky. This episode from the Rinzai Roku belongs to the same literary stratum as the other Fuke materials. Late Tang Zen anecdotes shaped into pedagogical scenes rather than historical reportage. As with most Rinzai narratives, its value does not lie in the factual reconstruction, but in how doctrinal positions are enacted through dramatic compression. The narrative turns on the request for a one-piece robe. In Zen discourse, this term carries a significance that exceeds its literal meaning. Commentators since Yanagida Seizan have noted that the jiduo functions as a figure for undivided practice, something complete in itself, not assembled from precepts, ritual acts, or stages of cultivation. Fuke's refusal of every robe offered to him signals a rejection of conventional religious provision. He is not asking for clothing. He is staging the impossibility of being given what cannot be supplied from outside. Rinzai's response, providing a coffin and naming it a one-piece robe, collapses the distinction between practice and death. The gesture is neither mockery nor compassion in the ordinary sense. It externalizes Rinzai's repeated insistence that there is nothing to obtain and nothing to preserve. The coffin functions as an enactment of death before death, the cutting off of the seeking subject prior to biological extinction. In this light, Fuke's acceptance of the coffin indicates not resignation, but non-discrimination. Robe and coffin, life and death, are not opposed. The remainder of the episode unfolds in the public space rather than within the monastery. This is consistent with Tang Zen's self-conscious rejection of secluded civilization as a privileged site of realization. Fuke's repeated announcements of his impending death operate as deliberate exhaustion of expectation. Each declaration invites intention. Repetition drains it of meaning. When the townspeople finally stop following him, the performance is complete. Realization, such as it is, occurs without witness. The delayed timing, announcing death without dying, should not be read as deception in any moral sense. Rather, it destabilizes ritualized expectations surrounding death, funerary sequence, and religious confirmation. Zen consistently resists scheduled insight. Enlightenment does not arrive on the third day. Death does not validate practice. Anticipation itself is what is being dismantled. The disappearance of Fuke's body belongs to a long hagiographic tradition shared by Buddhist and Taoist literature. Within the Zen context, however, the meaning is negative rather than miraculous. No relic remains, no body to enshrine, no trace that can ground institutional authority or lineage claims. The story refuses posthumous possession. Fuke does not become an object of memory. He becomes absence. In addition, in this narrative, erasure is critical for the later development of the Fuke sect because Puhua left no body, relics, no stupa, no text. He became a blank signifier. His physical disappearance allowed later traditions to project their own origins onto him without fear of contradicting physical evidence. The final detail, the sound of the bell lingering in the sky, reinforces this logic. Sound persists without a visible source. Function remains without substance. This aligns with Rinzai's language elsewhere. Phenomena arise and operate without a fixed locus. What is heard cannot be located, just as realization cannot be fixed to a person, a teaching, or an object. Later Japanese Fuke traditions retroactively seized upon this episode to legitimize musical and aesthetic practices, but the Rinzai text itself predates such developments. The bell here is not an instrument of cultivation, but a narrative device. Sound marks disappearance rather than practice. Breath, later central to Shakuhachi ideology, is absent from the story itself. Read with the Rinzai Roku, the episode serves as a closing gesture. Fuke does not inherit Rinzai's position. nor does he transmit a teaching. He vanishes without remainder. This is not failure but fulfillment. The story seals Rinzai's pedagogy by refusing continuity in any conventional sense. Nothing is attained, nothing is retained, nothing is left behind. That precisely is what the text insists upon. The original source of the Shidanoge. Fuke was always going around the streets ringing a little bell and calling out, "Coming as brightness, the brightness responds. Coming as darkness, the darkness responds. Coming from the four quarters in eight directions, like a whirlwind it flails. Coming from empty sky, lashing it is like a flail." The master told his attendant to go, and the moment he heard Fuke say these words to grab him and ask, "If coming is not at all thus, what then?" The attendant went and did so. Fuke pushed him away, saying, "There will be a feast tomorrow at Dabe Yuan." The attendant returned and told this to the master. The master said, "I've always held wonder for that fellow." Fuke in the streets, bell, voice, and deliberate unfixing. In this episode, Fuke appears not in a monastic setting, but in the public streets and marketplaces. This shift of location is already significant. Rather than teaching within an institutional or ritual framework, Fuke positions himself in the open, among ordinary people, engaging in repetitive and conspicuous behavior, ringing a handbell and chanting short formulaic lines. His verses follow a pattern structure. Brightness is met with brightness, darkness with darkness, the four quarters in eight directions with a whirlwind, emptiness itself with indiscriminate lashing. The structure is not poetic ornamentation, but functional symmetry. Whatever comes is met without discrimination, delay, or preference. The language does not define what brightness, darkness, or emptiness are, it only describes how they are met. In this sense, the verses are not metaphysical claims, but performative statements about responsiveness. Traditional Zen interpretation often maps brightness and darkness onto doctrinal binaries, distinction and equality, activity and stillness, but the text itself does not insist on such readings. What matters is not the symbolic content of the terms, but the refusal to privilege any one of them. Everything that comes is treated as an occasion for immediate response without appeal to principle or hierarchy. Rinzai's reaction is telling. Rather than engaging Fuke directly, he instructs an attendant to intervene. The attendant is to seize Fuke impose a conditional challenge. If coming is not at all like this, what then? The question attempts to expose a potential rigidity in Fuke's conduct, testing whether his formula has hardened into a fixed position. Fuke does not answer the question. Instead, he physically disengages, pushing the attendant aside, and deflects the entire exchange by announcing a mundane fact. There will be a meal at Dabe Temple in the following day. The response is neither evasive nor playful, it simply refuses the premise of the question altogether. The challenge is not met, it's not rebutted, and not elaborated upon. It's simply irrelevant. When the attendant reports this to Rinzai, the master's comment, "I've always held wonder for that fellow," is deliberately ambiguous. The phrase can indicate admiration, suspicion, or unresolved doubt. Importantly, Rinzai does not resolve the ambiguity either for himself or for the reader. The text leaves Fuke's status suspended. Several points stand out clearly. First, Fuke's bell ringing is not presented as ritual practice, aesthetic discipline, or meditative technique. There is no suggestion that it is to be imitated, transmitted, or systematized. Second, his verses do not articulate a doctrine. They function as situational utterances tied to an immediate action. Third, Fuke consistently avoids being drawn into explanatory discourse, even when directly challenged. Equally important is what the episode does not support. There is no indication that sound itself carries salvific power, nor that the bell functions as an object of contemplation. Fuke uses sound to provoke interruption, not absorption. His conduct destabilizes conceptual responses rather than cultivating interior states. Seen alongside the earlier table-turning episode, a consistent pattern emerges. Fuke does not negate Zen teaching. but he also does not contribute to its formal articulation. His role is that of a disruptive presence who exposes attachment to explanation, evaluation, and method, even when those attachments appear in the guise of Zen spontaneity itself. In this light, later portrayals of Fuke Zenji as a patriarch of sonic or shakuhachi-based practice represent a decisive reinterpretation. The Rinzai Roku presents Fuke not as a founder, transmitter, or exemplar of technique, but as a figure who persistently resisted being turned into any of these. His bell rings not to establish a tradition, but to prevent one from settling too comfortably into place. The Shidanoge and the problem of reading it. The previous Rinzai Roku passage we just went over contains the verse commonly known as the Shidanoge. It has long circulated within Shakuhachi and Fuke-associated traditions as a kind of cryptic battle chant. Its short, repetitive lines and striking diction have encouraged a martial reading, reinforced by the Edo period image of the komuso as half-monk, half-warrior, wandering Japan with a flute and a begging bowl. This image, however, is already a product of later mythologizing. The Shidanoge is neither a warrior's vow nor a statement of personal resolve. It is a text, and like many texts retrospectively associated with the Fuke tradition, it has been persistently mistranslated, sometimes through misunderstanding, sometimes to support a convenient institutional narrative. At the most basic level, the Shidanoge must be approached as a linguistic artifact. It is written not in Japanese, but in classical Chinese, kanbun. This distinction is crucial. The classical Chinese presented is compact and impersonal. It lacks an explicit grammatical subject and does not presume an acting self. Any interpretation that assumes an I who chooses, decides, or reacts is therefore already an interpretive overlay rather than a feature of the text itself. In the Sino-Japanese reading, Myōtō-rai Myōtō da, antō-rai antō da, shihō hachimen rai senpū da, kokū-rai renka da. Many modern translations, especially in English, introduce personal pronouns and intentional agency, rendering the opening lines as something like, if attacked in the light, I strike back in the light. Yet no such subject exists in the original language. There is no defender, no attacker, and no deliberative response. These elements were supplied by translators trained to expect ego, intention, and narrative causality. In a Zen context, such additions do not clarify meaning, they fundamentally alter it. Several recurring translation errors contribute to this distortion. One concern is the character to, commonly rendered as head. In classical Chinese usage here, however, it functions not as a reference to a person or identity, but as a classifier structuring abstract forces such as brightness and darkness. Another concern, kokū, often translated as empty sky, in Mahayana Buddhist discourse, kokū refers not to a physical expanse, but to emptiness itself, sunyata, the absence of inherent existence. This is ontological language. When these assumptions are stripped away, the verse begins to behave differently. It reads not as instruction, but as an event. A translation attentive to both grammar and Zen context might read like this: brightness arrives, brightness responds. Darkness arrives, darkness responds. From all directions it arrives. A whirlwind responds. Emptiness arises, the flail responds. Or this translation rendered by Torsten Olafsson, which interprets the Da character at the end as striking the bell. The dual nature of brightness appears, the duality of brightness strikes the bell. The dual nature of darkness appears, the duality of darkness strikes the bell. Whatever manifestations of dualism appear, whirlwinds strike the bell. When non-duality appears or manifests, a flail, a grain thresher, strikes the bell. In these readings, there is no subject and no strategy, only immediate correspondence. This brings the verse into direct alignment with the name and doctrinal orientation of Myoanji. The temple's name, Myoan, brightness, darkness, is not ornamental symbolism. In Zen thought, opposites do not negate one another, they arise together. The shidanoge is therefore not concerned with reacting correctly or defending oneself. It articulates non-separation. There is no one who is struck and no one who strikes. There is only brightness brightening, darkness darkening, emptiness emptying. Perception and action are not sequential events, but single occurrences. Most modern misunderstandings can be traced to a limited number of influential translations, particularly Tsuge Genenchi's 1977 rendering, later adopted, ironically, by Myōwanji itself. Tsuge introduces a personal subject, intentional action, and a martial narrative frame. Subsequent translators largely inherit these assumptions without returning to classical Chinese grammar. What is lost in the process is the core function of the text as an enactment of non-dual awareness rather than a description of conduct. One final correction is necessary. The ideas articulated in the Shidanoge, brightness and darkness as mutually arising, action without a central actor, non-duality enacted rather than explained, were not innovations of the Fuke tradition, nor of the Komuso, nor even of the Tang Dynasty eccentrics later folded into Fuke mythology. These ideas were already well established within the mainstream Zen discourse centuries earlier. By the late 7th century, the complementary pair of bright and dark had become a formal philosophical structure in Zen Buddhism. The Platform Sutra of the 6th Patriarch, Huineng, states explicitly, "Darkness does not become darkness by itself. It is dark because there is brightness. Darkness is manifested by brightness, and brightness is revealed by darkness." The same structure appears with even greater precision in the Sandokai of Shito Shishuan, Seikito Kisen of 700 to 790. Right in the light there is darkness, but don't take it as darkness. Right in the darkness there is light, but don't see it as light. Light and dark are relative to one another, like the front and back foot in walking. These passages describe how non-duality functions experientially. Light and dark are not opposites to be resolved, but codependent movements, like alternating steps, one impossible without the other. Placed in this context, the Shidanoge emerges not as a radical Fuke revelation, a secret martial formula, or a uniquely Shakuhachi-based philosophy, but as a compressed restatement of ideas already circulating widely in Zen discourse between the late 7th and mid-9th century. What the later Fuke tradition did was inherit this language, reframed it, and eventually mythologized it, embedding it in sound, breath, and finally in the Shakuhachi itself. The ideas were never exclusive, only the mask was. But how did Fuke Zenji get connected with Kakushin? Fuke Zenji and Shinchi Kakushin, a mid-17th century construction. The supposed connection between Fuke Zenji and Shinchi Kakushin, later honored as Hoto Kokushi, does not emerge from the Kamakura period itself. Rather, it is a product of mid-17th century textual invention. The earliest secure point at which the two figures are explicitly linked appear no later than 1646. Ishi Bunshu as the point of origin, 1640 to 1646. The decisive agent in this narrative construction is the Rinzai abbot Ishi Bunshu, 1608 to 1646. In his letter to the Proto-Komuso Sando Mugetsu, firmly dated to 1646, the year of Ishi's death, he articulates the first known textual framework that simultaneously, 1. presents Fuke as a Chinese patriarch, and 2. portrays Kakushin as the Japanese conduit for a supposed Kyomu lineage. A pivotal passage reads this: "In China there was Fuke. As for my own country itself, how possibly could Hoto Kokushi accomplish as the originator of the congregation?" The phrasing is revealing. Fuke is acknowledged as authentically Chinese, while the possibility of Kakushin serving as the Japanese originator is presented rhetorically, questioned, yet implied. This is not neutral genealogy, it is doctrinal persuasion, an early attempt to anchor a lineage in authority and legitimacy. The four Kyomu practitioners and retroactive lineage. Ishii further claims that during Kakushin's supposed sojourn in China, four Kyomu practitioners accompanied him back to Japan, later giving rise to multiple branches. No Kamakura period evidence exists for these figures. As with other Komuso genealogies predating the mid-17th century, these names and numbers are clearly retrospective fabrications, invented to stabilize an emerging religious and musical identity. Why does this matter? No Komuso institutions are documented prior to the second quarter of the 17th century. Temples such as Reihoji and associated genealogies appear only in documents from 1677 onward, and any pre-1600 entries are demonstrably fictional. Claims that Ishii's letters originates earlier, for example in 1598, are chronologically impossible, as Ishii hasn't been born yet. The implication is clear. The lineage, Fuke, Kakushin, Komuso, Shakuhachi practice is not inherited tradition. It is deliberate lineage making, crafted to confer historical legitimacy on nascent institutions. A final word on Ishii. Fuke Zenji's association with Kakushin originates entirely in Ishii Bunshu's mid-17th century intervention. Around 1646, Ishii was the first to explicitly wield together the three following points. 1. The Tang Dynasty's eccentric Fuke. 2. The Kamakura period monk Kakushin. And 3. The emerging Komuso Shakuhachi ideology. This construction reflects early Edo period concerns about authority and legitimacy, not historical transmission. Fuke's role in Japanese Shakuhachi history is therefore best understood as doctrinal fiction, crafted precisely at a moment when Komuso identity was still only in the making. Assembling the legend of Fuke, the Kyotaku Denki. The Kyotaku Denki and the construction of Fuke Zenji's Japanese legend. The Kyotaku Denki, or Tale of the False Bell, finalized in 1797, illustrates vividly how historical narrative can be assembled from a mixture of documentation, rumor, and invention. It is particularly revealing in showing how Fuke Zenji, a minor Tang Dynasty Zen figure, came to be retroactively enmeshed in Japanese Shakuhachi history long after his lifetime. Fuke left no writings of his own, and the earliest Japanese texts linking him to Shinichi Kakushin, who lived several centuries later, are demonstrably anachronistic. Examined closely, the Kyotaku Denki's claims appear increasingly absurd. 17th century origins. From the early decades of the 17th century, surviving documents suggest a gradual layering of figures, acts, and attributions. In the 1640s, Ishii Bunshu introduces Fuke Shinshi Kakushin, the so-called Komu Shizen, and Kakushin's four Chinese Buddhist laymen, Koji, describing as spreading the miraculous false bell sound throughout Japan. Yet, the historical plausibility of these accounts is immediately suspect. How could a 13th century figure, Shinchi Muhon Kakushin, later honored posthumously as Hoto Kokushi, have transmitted a Shakuhachi-based Fuke tradition to Japan in 1254, as the Kyotaku Denki claims? No contemporary evidence supports such a connection, and the anachronism is glaring. One plausible, though still provisional, explanation concerns the social dislocations following the Battle of Sekigahara and the subsequent Osaka siege. Countless defeated samurai and their retainers found themselves masterless, displaced, and without occupation. It is reasonable to imagine that some sought refuge in remote Buddhist temples, such as the Kokū Temple in Yura, Ki Province, modern-day Wakayama, originally founded in the mid-13th century by Shinshi Kakushin. These sites may have provided a convenient historical anchor for later constructions of lineage and legitimacy. Documented interpolations and the role of Ishii Bunshu. Reprinted versions of the 1628 Kaido Honsoku, the so-called Komuso or mat monks document, contained an intriguing addition, a top-line claim, likely added post-1628, that Hoto Kokushi had been accompanied by four Chinese laymen, Guo Zhou, Li Cheng, Ceng Shu, and Pao Pu. on his return from China in 1254. Internal evidence suggests this sentence was only inserted after Ishi Bunshu wrote to the hermit Sando Mugetsu by 1645, revealing the deliberate retroactive construction of a historical lineage. Why these four laymen were deemed significant remains a matter of speculation, but their appearance highlights the early 17th century tendency to graft invented actors onto existing religious and musical narratives. Komuso and the emergence of Kyoto lineages. By 1664, Nakamura Sosan reports Komuso playing short pieces in Kyoto, who regarded Shin Shikakushin as their Japanese founder, or transmitter of a supposedly Chinese flute tradition. It is unclear whether a Myowan temple existed in Kyoto at that time. By 1677, a preserved record confirms a Komuso temple, Reihoji, temple of the bell dharma, presumably referencing Fuke Zenji's bell. These incremental attestations suggest a slow, deliberate process of institutional legitimization for early Ronin outcast temples. Towards the end of the 17th century, a Myowan temple appears in Kyoto guidebook, and by 1694, the first reliably verified document cites its existence. Engetsu Ryogen, credited with founding the original Kyoto Myowan temple near the Great Buddha, emerges as a historically grounded figure in contrast to the legendary attributions later attached to the site. 18th century elaborations. The 18th century saw further institutional consolidation and imaginative narrative building. In 1703, documents show Kyoto Myowanji Temple formally pledging affiliation with Kokū Temple in Yura, Ki Province, as a subordinate or child temple of Kakushin's remote establishment. This request was approved in 1705. Curiously, the Yura Temple appears to have had no prior knowledge of the Kyoto Temple, and Myō-shinji, the mother temple in Kyoto overseeing Kokokuji, initially protested. Rumors suggested that financial inducements were later used to secure ordination for certain Buddhist flute monks as recognized Zen practitioners. By 1732, the Shakuhachi Denraiki records for the first time 3 classical ascetic shakuhachi pieces, Mukaeji, Kokū, and Kyōrei. In 1735, a Kyoto Myowanji document introduces Kyochiku Ryoen Zenji, later claimed as the temple's founder, although he does not appear in the printed 1795 Kyotaku Denki. The same text refers to him also as Rōan, perhaps conflating him with a 15th century figure who may have never existed. Constructing history and the mythic Fuke lineage. Taken together, these records demonstrate how the Kyotaku Denki's narrative was pieced together over nearly 2 centuries. Figures such as Fuke Zenji, Shin Shikakushin, and various imagined laymen were retroactively connected to justify temple authority, establish lineage, and create a compelling but largely invented musical and religious tradition. The text does not reflect a historically continuous transmission of shakuhachi practice from Tang China or the Kamakura period. Rather, it reveals the social and political and institutional imperatives of the 17th and 18th century Japan, projecting historical depth onto a series of local innovations and imaginative constructions. Fuke Zenji's role, celebrated in legend, is therefore best understood as posthumous construct, grafted centuries later onto Japanese Zen and shakuhachi history, rather than a literal transmitter of musical lineage. Bonus content, Hisamatsu Fuyo. Hisamatsu Fuyo and the limits of tradition. An interesting perspective emerges when we turn to Hisamatsu Fuyo, 1791 to 1871, a prominent early figure in the Kinko-ryu shakuhachi tradition. Fuyo's writings provide insight into the values and limitations of shakuhachi practice in the early 19th century, long before honkyoku performance had become the technically demanding, concert-oriented art form as it is today. In his 1818 publication, Hitorigoto, Fuyo cautioned against the deliberate pursuit of aesthetic polish in the beginner's practice. Sōshin yori utsukushii oto no mumami o shūgyō sube karazu, ねえんむまみwa dekiru kononde dekasu o kirau. From the beginning, literally with a beginner's intention, do not aesthetically practice the tastefulness of a beautiful sound. I dislike it when people please themselves with putting out tasteful sound gloss. Translation by Torsten Olafsson. These reflections suggest that Fuyō's practice and the Kinko-ryu's pedagogy he represented was not about virtuosic display. The emphasis was on natural emergence, humility, and attunement rather than deliberately being artistic. Fuyō on Fuke Zenji. Even more telling is Fuyō's own remarks regarding Fuke Zenji. In the 1823 Hitorimondo, he records this exchange. What kind of person was Master Puhua? I do not know. Ask a scholar at a Zen temple. This candid admission is revealing. Fuyō was neither a komuso nor a Zen monk. His knowledge about Fuke Zenji was purely intellectual or anecdotal. He could not answer doctrinal questions about Zen. He was, fundamentally, a dedicated shakuhachi practitioner who engaged with history and tradition at a practical, musical level, not as a member of a monastic lineage. In short, Hisamatsu Fuyō illustrates the distinction between the mythic Fuke of later komuso narratives and the lived musical reality of early shakuhachi practice. He revered the instrument and its sound, but did not claim institutional Zen or sectarian authority. Fuyō's perspective provides a refreshing counterpoint to the Edo constructions, a reminder that for much of the history of shakuhachi, devotion to sound could exist entirely independently of fabricated lineages, legendary patriarchs, and doctrinal fiction. Conclusion: the bell after the bell. If there is a single thread running through all of this material, it is refusal. Refusal to settle, refusal to harden, refusal to be made useful too quickly. In the Tang source, Fuke does not find, transmit, authorize, or explain. He interrupts. He overturns tables, rings a bell, announces death, and does not comply with it on schedule. He frustrates disciples, confounds masters, and disappears without leaving behind so much of an empty coffin. The texts do not reward the reader with clarity, closure, or lineage. They end instead in absence, in sound without source. Everything that later traditions most desire from him, a method, a practice, a sonic discipline, a sectarian origin, is precisely what the early records withhold. The Japanese Fuke tradition did not inherit this refusal. Beginning in the 17th century, at a moment of social dislocation and institutional need, Fuke was retrofitted into a patriarch. His bell was slowed, hollowed, and given finger holes. Breath was added where the Tang texts are silent. What had been disruptive presence became a legitimating ancestor. What had resisted continuity was pressed into service as its guarantee. This was not fraud in the crude sense, nor deception. It was lineage making, a creative ideology act shaped by Edo period concerns about authority, movement, and identity. The Kyotaku Denki does not preserve history, it manufactured one. It projects continuity backward in order to stabilize the present. In doing so, it tells us far more about 17th century and 18th century Japan than it ever could about 9th century Tang Dynasty. Yet none of this renders the tradition meaningless. Myths endure not because they have truth in them, but because they answer needs. Seen clearly, Fuke Zenji becomes something more interesting than a founder. He becomes a limit case, a figure who shows us where history ends and interpretation begins. A bell that rings once in a Tang text and then keeps echoing not because it was struck again, but because later generations needed to hear something there. The task then is not to silence that bell, nor to romanticize it, but to hear it accurately. To know when we are listening to Tang Chan, when we are hearing Edo ideology, and when we are responding to our own projections about sound, breath, and awakening. Nothing is lost by this clarity. On the contrary, something essential is regained. Because when Fuke Zenji is released from the burden of lineage, he returns to what the text actually shows. Not a teacher to follow, not a method to practice, not a sound to cultivate, but a disturbance that will not let us rest comfortably in explanation. The townspeople All came scrambling. Upon opening the coffin, they saw he had vanished, body and all. Only the sound of his bell could be heard in the sky, receding away. Tinkle, tinkle, tinkle.